Very well. Very well.
Is Nigeria on lockdown?
Yeah, we are reopening gradually.
And how has it been? It's been very hard to implement lockdown and stay at home and masks in the U.S. It turns out that we're not very good at following rules. How has it been getting people in Nigeria to follow the rules and stay at home and wear masks?
Very difficult. Well, the educated people are doing it pretty well, but the less educated people are not doing it at all. Well, you guys over there, you have right-wing folks who don't believe all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's troubling is the layer of polarization that's happening on top of this. And I guess we'll get into this in the conversation, but it's what we're seeing is this sort of the convergence of a global health crisis, a global economic crisis, the crisis of information and disinformation, and a political crisis, and it's all happening at the same time. And it's an inflection point, a series of inflection points that we've been anticipating and that we've been approaching. But I think we would have preferred to go through each of them more thoughtfully and one at a time, and we're coming into it all.
So I was trying to reach you for us to have this conversation before the whole country, so that we could clarify that.
Oh, well, I'm delighted we finally found our way. And and Pastor Poju, however you want to, I know we had talked about me speaking for 20 25 minutes up front and then taking questions, but I'm also happy to have it be an even more dynamic, just question and answer fireside chat with you. However you think will be most interesting to you and
Uh,
your audience.
okay, all right, all right. You can start now. Maybe you just start the conversation going, and then we take questions from there.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, first of all, I'm so thrilled to be here.
All right, first, maybe I should do a formal introduction.
Okay, perfect. All right, great.
All right, let me just try and do that. All right. All right, welcome folks to this webinar with Jared Cohen. We've publicized this for a while, and Jared is not new to Nigeria, and he's also not new to the platform. And he'll be speaking this evening, and we'll be holding a conversation on the emerging world, a high-level discussion of geopolitical trends and opportunities for emerging nations. And Jared Cohen is a New York Times best-selling author, a foreign policy expert, and a technologist. And I will personally, I will want no other person but him to have this important conversation with. So I'll be turning it over to Mr. Jared for him to speak, and then we'll come back with questions and answers.
That sounds great, and I want to make sure that I don't start off by speaking for too long, because I'm most excited about all the questions that we're gonna get to. But first, let me say, Pastor Poju, it's great to be back to the platform. I was trying to remember when I first came to speak to you all. It must have been 2012, 2013,
Yeah.
sometime around then. But the energy of your network is extraordinary, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I remember standing in the stadium.
Yes.
I think we had 10 to 15,000 people, and there's something about standing in a stadium that you get really. There's an energy that comes, and so you add the fact that it's Nigeria, and that energy is really amplified. And I remember I got to yell out to the congregation, "Ekaro Lagos." And I might be misremembering that, but that's what I said, and I feel like I got resounding cheers as a result. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all. I have a real affinity for Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. I began my career studying sub-Saharan Africa, specifically looking at Rwanda and the genocide and its recovery. I looked at conflict resolution, and it's interesting. I started my career looking at the challenges across sub-Saharan Africa, and now, all these years later, I find myself, as it pertains to sub-Saharan Africa, and Nigeria in particular, focus on all the opportunities and assets that the world gets from this extraordinary country and this extraordinary continent, because I think the best innovation, comes, Nigeria in particular. There's something about the energy of the I've been to 110 countries, and I have never encountered a population with a greater innovative spirit, a greater energy, a greater commitment to problem solving. That I think Nigeria's best years are ahead of it. And the punchline of what I'm going to say today is what I want to talk about, why I think when the COVID-19 era ends, it could really be quite a moment for Nigeria, and I'll come back to that. I've been to the country 4 times. Unfortunately, I've never been outside of Lagos. So, Pastor Koju, my ask to you is I will come back to the platform a 3rd time, but on one condition, that we get me outside of Lagos. Because I love Lagos, but it's an extraordinary country. I need to see I need to see much, much more. And to all of the Nigerian women who are participating today, some of the most extraordinary leaders that I've met in the world have been Nigerian women. Some of my best employees over the years have been Nigerian women. So especially as we sort of think about the era of women's empowerment, I think Nigeria has been way ahead of the curve for a long time. So what I want to do is, I was asked to kind of, talk a little bit about the emerging world, and I have this unusual blend of foreign policy expertise, political expertise, and technology expertise. But because I've sort of worked at high levels in all of those areas and written in all of those areas, I'm able to think about how they all relate to each other. It used to be that these were sort of three separate, isolated topics where you'd have a conversation about international relations, you'd have a conversation about the future of technology, and you'd have a conversation about politics. And also, I'd throw in another one there, which is you'd have a conversation about how the workplace is changing. And those would be four separate and distinct conversations. But in the COVID-19 era, all of those things are merged into the same conversation. Because of something that is impacting international relations, which is this global health crisis, we're all working from home and it's changing the nature of work. It's all getting politicized, which is changing the nature of politics, and it's creating both opportunities and pitfalls when it comes to technology. So it all kind of comes together in this perfect storm. So before we look at, I think what I want to do is divide this up into where were we before COVID-19 happened. We have to remember where the world was and what was happening, politically, what was happening geopolitically, what was happening economically, and what was happening technologically. Then I want to talk a little bit about the impact that COVID-19 has had on all of this. And then I want to come and it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster because I'm going to sound pessimistic, but that's why I said at the beginning, my punchline is going to be why my pessimism about what's happening across the world makes me very optimistic about what can and what I believe will happen in Nigeria. So first, I want to make a few points about where we were before COVID-19. So let's start with the techno-geopolitical context. So the last 10 years, we have been talking about an access revolution, which is, populations coming online. And before COVID-19, the last couple of years have really been defined by, how has the world changed by what is now more or less technological ubiquity. And you cannot talk about what is happening technologically in the present and what will happen technologically in the future without acknowledging a rivalry between the United States and China when it comes to technology, and how that will shape an entire global ecosystem. Because the software, the hardware, the big companies, the ethical conversations, all of these things are wrapped up in a rivalry between two countries that present two very different visions for what the technology, what the world's technological landscape should look like. Now, people like to say this is Cold War 2.0. This is not a Cold War between the U.S. and China. It's unprecedented for the United States to have its most formidable adversary in the world also be its biggest trading partner in the world. Remember, Chinese hardware runs American operating systems, right? Wow. The economies are intertwined with each other. We haven't decoupled. We're highly integrated, physically, economically, and technologically. And so the question is, how long will that integration last before a kind of decoupling type moment? So that's the first reason this is not a Cold War. The second reason this is not a Cold War is if you look at what China is trying to do with its technological vision around the world, this is about economics. This is not about, they're not after ideological assimilation. They're not, promoting Huawei around the world to try to get people in different parts of the world to assimilate into kind of Han, Chinese culture. That's not the goal here. So, the problem is we like these historic analogies to try to understand the present. What I always tell people, and I recognize some people on the call, enjoy a good beer. Some people, don't drink, but I'm going to use a cocktail analogy, which is what we need to think of ourselves as a geopolitical bartender and ask ourselves which of the ingredients from history are required to make the geopolitical cocktail that explains this moment between the US and China, which defines the technological order we're trying to make sense of. So there's some elements of colonialism, there's some elements of a Cold War, there's some elements of free market capitalism, there's some elements of the 30 Years' War in the sense that there's kind of an ungovernability to all of it, and we're in this kind of perpetual state of cyber conflict. But there's no perfect way to describe it. What's clear is we need to understand first the facts of where is China technologically and where is the United States technologically. We need to understand that in order to see how this rivalry will play out. So let's start with China. China basically got a slow start. The U.S. had the first mover advantage on technology, but China got very, very smart on strategy. And through sort of savvy strategy around technology, China has managed to not just catch up technologically, but actually surpass the U.S. technologically in a number of areas. And they never want to be in that situation again of having to play catch up. So let's look at the details on this. China is beating the U.S. in payments, e-commerce, facial recognition, voice recognition. We're about 50-50 between China and the U.S. in phone manufacturing. 60% of the world's venture capital went into the U.S. versus 40% going into China, so they're about even. China has 80% of the commercial drone market. I think something like 8 of the top 10 AI research papers last year came out of China. China has the fastest growing company in the world, which is ByteDance, which is known for TikTok. China has 5G contracts in 40 plus countries with Huawei, operating on sub-6 spectrum. The U.S. has 0, so they have a major first mover advantage on 5G. And then China plays by a different set of rules when it comes to surveillance and other things that allows it to move faster in areas like artificial intelligence. They're beating the U.S. in quantum communications, but they're not beating the U.S. in quantum computing. And they've built the world's most sophisticated super surveillance apparatus. So the Chinese have a system called CloudWalk, where they can recognize any face in the country in less than 2.8 seconds with 87% accuracy. Now, when I came to speak at the platform, a little less than a decade ago, what I would have told you, and I would have been wrong, is that a country the size of China, so let's say 1.4, 1.5 billion people, would not be able to maintain its centralized authoritarian system in an era of technological ubiquity. It just wouldn't be possible. Too many people with too many devices taking pictures of too many things and too much free thought. I would have been wrong. That was my assumption. But they have managed to figure out over time how to navigate the transition to not just a highly technological society, but a proper technological superpower, where in a number of areas that I mentioned, they also have supremacy. The other thing that China is doing is they're recognizing that when it comes to the international system, a lot of the rules that govern how states behave towards each other, they haven't really been written. So in many parts of the international system, when it comes to multilateralism, China is trying to rewrite the world order. In the case of technology, they're essentially trying to create the world order in the absence of it really existing. They're also trying to sort of through the sort of forums around standards and other things, they're trying to kind of reimagine global integration on Chinese terms. So that's the sort of China side of it. The U.S. has several distinct advantages that I think are inherent in the democratic system, which is there's a set of values around openness and free flow of information and separation between public sector and private sector that come with U.S. technologies. The U.S. is still the leader in AI, still the leader in quantum computing, still leading in innovation, still has the best computer science institutions in the world. It still has the leading operating systems, but the U.S. is still falling way behind in terms of strategy. So China has actually published a list of the technologies that it says it absolutely needs to get a strategic advantage of, and the U.S. hasn't published a subsequent list. So that's the first point: is for all of you out there that are entrepreneurs and thinking about technology, before COVID-19 happened, all of this was wrapped up in a US-China rivalry, because ultimately, whatever you build or whatever company you create in Nigeria, you're going to need hardware, you're going to need software, you're going to need trading data, you're going to need models for machine learning and AI work that you're doing, and you're going to kind of have a choice of what China offers or what the US offers. Right now, it's still very blended, but over time, you may find yourself having to make a choice. The second point that I'll make about the pre-COVID-19 era is we were already experiencing a decline in democracy around the world. Oh, sorry, hold on, my computer fell asleep. There we go. So, we were seeing more polarization. We were seeing weaker leaders. We were seeing a retreat from multilateralism that was punishing for smaller countries. We were seeing more sort of instances of hate boiling up to the surface. We were basically seeing democratic countries go it alone, and we were seeing a decaying of multilateral institutions. So that was already happening. That was already happening before this. So what I would have said to you before COVID-19 hit is, when I look at authoritarian systems and I look at democratic systems, it seems like the authoritarian systems are having an easier time dealing with and managing the problems of being closed than open democratic systems are navigating the complexities of being open. And I attribute this to really the marriage of traditional cybersecurity issues like hacking of systems and infrastructure with these growing efforts designed to hack the discourse and the conversation, which I think have caused polarization to explode. The other thing that I would attribute it to is the accelerated pace of movement making, and the notion that anybody who emerges on the scene becomes sort of a public figure right away and open to scrutiny has made it much harder to emerge as a leader. So if you think about the great leaders of the world, Mandela, De Gaulle, Lech Walesa, a number of others, I find it very hard to believe that any of them would have had the space and the tolerance for sort of imperfection to become the kinds of leaders that they eventually became in the era of social media. There's just too much of an appetite for takedown culture, and whereas the men that I mentioned, they became leaders before they became public figures. So we've reversed it now, where you'll never see a new leader emerge in any country in the world that doesn't first start as a public figure.
Wow.
And that public figure status will cause them to have to kind of backfill the leadership skills. The third thing that I would sort of describe as relevant to the pre-COVID-19 era is, remember, there were a lot of geopolitical problems happening before COVID-19. Never have the geopolitical crises of the world been less top of mind than they are now. But you still had North Korea and Iran presenting nuclear proliferation threats. You had Venezuela, Syria, and Iraq as collapsed states. You had ISIS regaining strength, not to mention the number of other growing terror threats. You still had the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is going to heat up tomorrow. You have the worst global refugee crisis in modern history, with no end in sight. Eastern Ukraine remaining under Russian occupation, as well as the Crimea. Multilateralism seeming out of fashion. Climate change as arguably the greatest threat that impacts 195 countries that we were ill-equipped to address. And recently, China and India have seen their worst clashes since the 1970s. So all that's still going on, by the way, and that's before we get into the many conflicts in different countries all around the world. That's just a snapshot of them. So all of those are still going on. Militants, terrorists, criminals, they don't stop what they're doing because of COVID-19. They exploit it. They exploit the fact that everybody's home. They exploit the fact that everybody's gone digital. They exploit the fact that the world is distracted. Now, the last point that I'll mention about before COVID-19 is, because of technology, our very sense of identity was beginning to transform. So my guess is, of all the people that are on the call right now, everybody uses multiple social networking profiles, uses multiple instant messaging services. you basically have lots of different profiles across lots of different platforms, and you use them for different purposes. So the version of me on LinkedIn is different than the version of me on Facebook. I use WhatsApp for a different type of communication than I use Signal and Telegram for. My TikTok profile is a different version of me, than another profile. So basically, all of us in the era of technology, we've been proliferating versions of ourselves. So rather than thinking about Jared, the physical individual, or Pastor Poju, the individual, who we are is an aggregate of the multiple personalities that we are creating for ourselves. So each of us walks around with a virtual entourage of all of these different versions of us, and who we are is an aggregate of kind of how all those things interact with each other. And so the good news is we can be in more places in more ways than ever before. The bad news is sometimes our identities trip over themselves. So our whole sense of identity was changing. Also, our whole sense of health and well-being was changing, right? So how healthy, we split our time between physical and digital worlds. So how healthy we are is an aggregate of our physical well-being, meaning, are we sick? Are we, in good shape? Do we, are we making sure that we catch any disease early? And how vulnerable our systems are. How vulnerable, we are to getting phished or hacked or infected with malware. My guess is people on this call, I would certainly put myself in this category. I'm much more in the COVID-19 era. Right now, under lockdown, I am much more worried about getting digitally sick than I am getting physically sick. I'm not going to get physically sick. I don't see anybody. I haven't seen anybody other than on a screen in 4 months. I am very, very worried about getting digitally sick, as my entire professional and personal life has moved completely online in a way that has never existed before. And so what happens, there's something about human nature where we're willing to inconvenience ourselves when it comes to dealing with our physical health. We can't handle or seem to absorb even the mildest inconvenience when it comes to making sure our system is updated, making sure we're not using the same passwords, making sure we use two-factor authentication, and so many other things. So what's happened with COVID-19? Well, I'll just sort of rattle these through, and then let's get to questions and answers. What's happened with COVID-19 is the democratic world remains in crisis, and that crisis is deepening. For the next 1 to 2 years, every democratic country is going to have to opt into semi-autocratic restrictions on civil liberties just to get through the public health crisis. And that's going to have a profound impact on a lot of these countries. The second is China has moved or shifted the paradigm from a choice of open systems versus closed systems and trying to argue the virtues of one or the other. And they're now just making an argument about efficiency. They're trotting around the world providing medical supplies to every single country, and now they're coming in with their version of 5G. They're coming in with their version of AI. They're coming in with their social networks, and they're basically saying, do you want a more efficient option or do you want a less efficient option? So that efficiency argument has become doctrinal to what China is trying to do, and technology is all about efficiency. So in many respects, COVID-19 has given China an opportunity to make an efficiency argument that naturally lends itself towards what they're trying to do technologically. There seems to be a consistent view around the world as countries brace for a second wave that populations aren't going to be willing to do a lockdown the way that they were willing to do it before. And countries are kind of grappling with that, particularly in Europe. There's also a debate that's now happening around, I think that most democratic countries now reject the idea of total globalization and total integration. So the question is, what does limited globalization look like? So expect supply chains to move around, expect the establishment of kind of these zones of trust where like-minded states come together and make certain decisions. We're also seeing major tests to the political system. So the same groups in Europe, for instance, that were polarizing these societies around the migration issue are the same groups that are polarizing these countries around the COVID-19 issue. And it's a very awkward thing for a lot of these countries because, the groups that were arguing for greater immigration, the groups that were arguing for greater openness now have to embrace the idea of closed borders because of the public health crisis. And the groups that were arguing that the state had too heavy a hand in the population are now relying on the state to get through all of this. So I expect some of the big multilateral issues like climate change to fall down on the priority list as we see a retreat from multilateralism. And then, I think that countries coming out of COVID-19 are going to take stock of who's behaving well and who's not behaving well during this crisis. Who can we trust and who can we rely on? Who proves to be innovative and who doesn't? And I guess that brings me to my point about why I think this is Nigeria's moment. The reason I think this is Nigeria's moment is you have one of the largest populations in the world, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I believe the most innovative and entrepreneurial population in the entire world. And I really, really mean that. I've never seen anything like what I've seen coming out of Nigeria. And, while the rest of the world is struggling, I think, Nigeria can really rise to the occasion, because what Nigeria has always done well is problem solve. And what I would have said, and what I probably said when I came to speak at the platform last time, is necessity drives innovation. And part of the reason innovation coming out of sub-Saharan Africa is so strong is people know resilience and people know how to problem solve. And that translates into technology. So the same logic when I was a teenager traveling to Tanzania, where you give a kid an old pair of sneakers and they come back brand new to the point where you want your sneakers back. That same logic applies to technology, right? So what I find is I would say the average Nigerian can do more with their phone than I can. The average Nigerian can do more with their devices than I can. The average Nigerian will be more creative about how to use technology then, because there's a built-in resilience that I've always admired. And I think that what you're seeing in the developed world is we're being tested on how resilient we are, and we're not passing the test. So the combination of technology in Nigeria, the extraordinary experience with resilience and innovation, and the unique entrepreneurial spirit of the population, I believe means that coming out of this, Nigeria should not just be the leading technological player in sub-Saharan Africa. I think if you were to imagine a G20 for extraordinary technology nations, Nigeria would absolutely and should absolutely be part of it. So with that, Pastor Poju, let's open it up to some questions.
All right, sir. The first question I'm going to take is a lot of great companies have been formed during past recessions. For example, Slack, Instagram, Uber were created in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. There's a question, what are some big problems that you think entrepreneurs can build great companies to solve through this recession, this COVID-19 season?
So that's a great question. So I'll give you the short-term answer and the long-term answer. The short-term answer is you want, a successful company builds something that everyone in the world wants and needs. So right now, what I would say is the biggest thing that countries are dealing with right now, where I have not seen a good solution, is in the education space. The education space is ripe for disruption and innovation. So you have Zoom. So you have schools have all gone to Zoom as an example. The lack of the limited amount of innovation that is happening in how we transform the classroom and how we create a richer educational experience, even when COVID-19 is over. Schools are trying to figure out, how do we combine, remote and in person. I think that getting, a company that could really nail the future of education is a company that's going to become a multi-billion-dollar company and utilized in 195 countries. I still think that one of the interesting things for where Nigerian entrepreneurs can also really innovate, the pace of innovation in Nigeria has not kept up with the physical infrastructure of the country. So I think that delta between the physical infrastructure and and when I say physical infrastructure, I also mean like the underlining, technological infrastructure, not the innovation on top of it. That's not a unique problem to Nigeria. It's a very common problem to the entire developing world, but I think Nigerians are better positioned to figure out how to build platforms in limited bandwidth situations, how to build platforms with sort of unreliable or intermittent infrastructure. So I think that some of those access questions, Nigerian entrepreneurs are very, very well suited to. I think the payment space is another area where I think there's extraordinary opportunities for Nigerian entrepreneurship. Right now, most countries are kind of, building payments platforms for their own countries. What I'm starting to see happen is we're beginning to see an approach that is starting to span across multiple countries and regions, and it's largely coming from the nonprofit sector. So there's a real opportunity to build the premier payments platform for the country, for the continent, and for the world. And then longer term, my message to entrepreneurs is build for the future, don't build for the present, right? And so the most successful companies are the ones that are able to look around the corner and spot a moment that is not fully yet recognized. So a simple way to think about this is the following, which is, the world is going to be transformed by 5G in the next, I would say, 1 to 7 years. And the instinct is for us to look at the innovations that are going to be unlocked by 5G and view it as an extension of what we see with 4G. But let's remember what 5G does. 5G transports data at an unprecedented volume at an unprecedented speed with almost no latency and connects billions of devices all at the same time. That's going to unlock innovations that are entirely impossible to predict. So the secret sauce for any Nigerian entrepreneur is to bet on the types of innovation ecosystems that today are unpredictable. So I will make a very dangerous move, which is I will attempt to predict what I think that looks like, which is I think that what the 5G world is going to unlock is what you could describe as a post-phone world, right? So if you look at your mobile device, right? So if I look at this, 95% of what I do on this, I do not need something this large and this clunky. Yet I do all of these things where this device is too big. What 5G will allow you to do, again, because of the transport of data at that size with low latency and the ability to connect all these devices together, is I believe that what will happen is we'll have an operating system that's small. And that operating system will exist on a piece of hardware. And that'll just be in your pocket like your wallet. It'll never leave your pocket. It's not something you use. It's not something you look at. But what it will do is connect to a bunch of augmented devices. So right now I'm wearing a dress shirt. If I want to check my email, why do I need to look at my phone? My operating system in my pocket should be able to connect to my smart sleeve, which is smart because I have a chip in my tag and a microscopic wire that runs down my sleeve. You can't really see it, but I should be able to just read my email on my sleeve. Or if I'm wearing a tie, I should be able to pull up the back of my tie and read my email there. So imagine a world in which you basically have small chips with microscopic wires connecting, to the things that you wear, the things that you touch, the things that you ride in, the things in your surrounding, and all the things that you normally would do on a phone, you do in your surroundings, and it's all controlled by an operating system that exists on a tiny piece of hardware that sits in your pocket. That's the world that I think 5G is going to open up, and that's the world that I think we should be building for. If you look historically, we have always strived for smaller devices that are more convenient for us. That has been consistent. This is not convenient. Nobody who has a phone thinks that this is convenient. This is our best option right now. So when you think about 5G and you think about future companies, try to imagine if you had your druthers the way that you would want to do all the things that you currently do on a phone. And my guess is the things that I would sort of subscribe to the view that if you can think of it, the 5G ecosystem can make it real.
All right. Okay, the second question is, we have not seen the rise of global brands founded in Africa in the way we have seen Skype from Sweden, Tata from India. This new digital first era probably holds the most promise in this regard. Given the prospect of acquiring customers and distributing services via the internet, what advice do you have for entrepreneurs aspiring to build global brands? Are there any specific steps you have seen founders in other regions take to accelerate this process of scaling?
So first thing is, I think it's coming. I think in the next 5 years, some of the biggest companies are going to come out of sub-Saharan Africa. I think that there's huge opportunities in the public health space. Again, I mentioned education as another one. There's huge opportunities in the communication space. There's huge opportunities in the payment space. What I would say is, the most successful companies and the most successful ideas, they don't try to do everything at once. They always start with a small, narrow problem that they want to solve. And the inclination for the entrepreneur typically has several instincts that are good and several instincts that are not good. The instinct that's good is they identify that narrow problem and they start there. The bad instinct is they're worried about collaborating because they don't want somebody to steal their idea, or they are reticent to collaborate. So you need collaboration around a concrete idea. The second mistake that I see entrepreneurs make is they try to broaden their company and their idea too fast, because it's more, they like to think bigger, and it's much more exciting and interesting to imagine. So the best companies are built on an idea that is not as, and a problem that is not as interesting as the problems you eventually want to solve. But in order to solve the sort of broader problems, you need to first prove that you can solve a specific problem. And so what I always tell entrepreneurs is there's a saying in the US, which I don't know if it's a saying in Nigeria as well, which is cool your jets, which is what you say to somebody when they're getting overly excited and want to do too many things at the same time. So focus, focus, focus. Pick that narrow problem. And the other thing the other mistake that I often hear entrepreneurs make is they identify a problem, and as they examine who else is solving it, they see someone else has come up with a solution to it. That does not disqualify you from doing it as well. There were many versions of Facebook before Facebook emerged on the scene. There were many versions of WhatsApp before WhatsApp emerged on the scene. So if someone else has solved your problem and isn't a $500 billion company with dominant global market share, then it means that there's still plenty of room for you in the market. And there's a long history of looking at somebody solving the same problem that you want to solve and realizing you can do it better.
Wow.
Remember, competition is what fuels innovation.
All right, that's good. All right, now the third question here has to do with Black Lives Matter. So many people hope that Black Lives Matter movement will lead to major transformation in race relations and more economic inclusions for Blacks in Europe and in America. But we've seen some of these mass movements start with much hope, like the Arab Spring, but eventually they fail to deliver much results. And in some cases, things even have gotten worse. What is your own perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement being able to have lasting positive impact on American society? And what might be the key determinants of whether the things will get better or worse?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, the country is going through a bit of a reckoning right now on issues of race that have been systemic, not dealt with, and institutionalized in the history of the United States. So, my feeling on the Black Lives Movement is we should be very grateful that it exists, but it shouldn't have taken this long for us to be trying to have this conversation. So in my other career, I'm a presidential historian. And if you look at the history of race and discrimination in America, we were one of the last countries in the world to get rid of slavery. We amended the Constitution to get rid of slavery, and then we basically found a way to resurrect a version of it with 100 years of segregation. And then we got rid of segregation, and as sort of new legislation, addressed certain aspects of racism. We never dealt with the underlying causes behind racism, so it persisted long after segregation, and we see it highly pronounced today. I think that part of the problem is the U.S. has not figured out how to do truth and trauma and reconciliation, and it's fascinating to me because from Colombia to Rwanda to South Africa, to Northern Ireland, to many countries around the world, they look backwards to reconcile the past and deal with the past before they move forward. The U.S. has never pressed rewind on slavery, segregation, and discrimination against Black people in America. The U.S. never pressed rewind on treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II when they were put in internment camps. We've never pressed rewind on treatment of Jews, treatment of women, treatment of the LGBTQ community. We haven't pressed rewind on treatment of Catholics and so many other groups. The mentality in the U.S. for hundreds of years has been, we're going to move forward, we're going to legislate, we're going to improve, we're going to iterate. The problem is, as an entrepreneur, you can do launch and iterate. When you're dealing with the stain of racism and the stain of slavery that was architected from the beginning of the Republic for 100 plus years, you can't launch and iterate. You need to deal with the sin of slavery, and you need to educate the population. You need to put the kinds of reforms. It's not good enough to just talk about it. It's not good enough to just say we'll do better. If you look, let's take a state like Mississippi. A white person in Mississippi, looking at an impoverished Black person in Mississippi, needs to understand the history of why that person is impoverished and the systemic racism by law and by norm that has created uneven paths correlated to race in this country. So I'm hopeful, because I don't think that this moment feels different than other moments where we have supposedly had a reckoning around race. The fact that it's happening in an election moment, I think, is really amplifying it. My concern is, talking about it again is not enough. It's not obvious to me how we get to the sets of steps that are necessary to really deal with this. We don't have a good tradition in the United States of reconciling the past. There needs to be some reckoning with the past and some effort to use that reckoning to move forward. But I think we're in the earliest stage of this. So I'm hopeful, because of the conversation feels much more real right now. But I'm not more than cautiously optimistic that we're going to navigate the right path there.
All right. From your experience with developing ideas, what does it take to really make ideas scale, and how do we generate ideas that will be impactful on society?
So what I always tell entrepreneurs is you have to have a healthy disregard for the impossible. And if you don't have at least 10 people telling you that'll never work, or someone's already doing that, then you shouldn't do it. The language of that will never work and someone's already doing it is the language of the bureaucrat. And when bureaucrats are telling you that, it means that you're onto something that's too hard for most people. So that's my first lesson, is have that healthy disregard for the impossible. 2, you have to take risks. And I think especially for millennials, they like certainty, right? So they don't want to found the company until they know it's going to be $1 billion company. They don't want to, they acknowledge but don't want to reckon with the fact that for all the sort of Facebooks and Ubers and Twitters and Googles of the world, there's a graveyard of failed startups that is much larger. But the reality is, if you want to build a great company, it means that you'll have your moments where you don't know if you're going to make payroll. You have your moments where you feel like the whole thing is going to fall apart. So you have to have an appetite for risk. The third thing that I would say, which I think is something that I've kind of learned at different stages of my career, is when you're building a company from scratch, there's a set of people that you need at the beginning that are different than the people you need when you go from one person to 25 people to 50 people, 50 people to 100 people, 100 people to 500 people, 500 people to 1,000 people, and so forth. So the biggest challenge for somebody starting a company is, how do you hire people at the beginning that as your company grows and the culture changes, you're still going to want at the company? Every culture problem And every road bump that I've seen from startups, it typically originates with a clash between the needs of the company and the talent that exists from that initial batch of hires. So, the best entrepreneurs are the ones that can iterate with the workforce and the ones that can hire for the long haul as opposed to just that first year.
Wow. Wow. All right. The next one we can take is the phrase new normal has become the most used expression to describe life after COVID-19. How do we differentiate between what the new normal might really look like and some of these cliches that may just be flying around? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's a great. So I don't think. I mean, I can speak for myself. I don't want to go back to the way I used to do things. Right now, so I have 3 kids. I'm working harder than I've ever worked. I'm spending more time with my family than I've ever spent. And I'm taking on more side projects than I've ever taken on. And I'm doing more writing than I've ever done. So there's still 24 hours in the day. So how is that possible? I've removed some of the negative externalities, like a commute to work, wasted time, meandering around the office, time on airplanes, traveling, time zone all these different things. So the level of efficiency is extraordinary, but that works right now because everybody's in the same situation, right? So I don't think that we're going to have a return to normalcy. I don't think that we're going to have like a work renaissance. I think that we're going to find a sort of healthy hybrid of how things are now and how they used to be. And I think for anybody running a business or an organization like you, Pastor Poju, it's going to be a very individual choice made by leaders of organizations as to what blend they want to see. So for me running an organization or you running an organization, the people in your organization will expect some kind of hybrid. And the challenge for a leader is to figure out how to maximize efficiency with that new hybrid. I don't think it's efficient for people to be in the office from 9 to 5 every single day. I think there's a more efficient way to do that. I don't think it's efficient for people to be commuting to work 2 hours every single day. So what's also interesting, what I've heard from a lot of friends is a lot of the nonsense that for anybody that's a manager, nonsense takes up a lot of time. And people problems take up a lot of time. And a lot of that shrinks and begins to evaporate in a remote working situation. I also think what's interesting is some leaders are made for remote working, some are not. You have good you have good in-person leaders and good remote leaders, but the best leaders are going to be the ones who can dance between the two. Can you be charismatic in person and online? Can you be charismatic in both circumstances at the same time? Can you do? I think we're going to see a lot of customized management, which is if you're managing a team of people, don't manage monolithically. Don't come up with the same set of rules that govern. Figure out what makes sense on a person by person basis. So I think we're going to see a transformation in how people lead, and some people will get it right, some people will get it wrong. But I do think the whole office experience is going to change.
Great. All right. There's a question. If you were to write an updated version of your book you wrote in 2013, the new digital age, what more insights will it contain, and how much has the world evolved since you wrote that book?
So I would say, and by the way, since there's a lot, I encourage everybody to buy the book. And let me tell you why. Not because we want to get me more book sales. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. But when Eric Schmidt and I wrote that book in 2013, we were told that our predictions were too out there, too extreme. If you read that book today, it is a better, in my opinion, it is a better description of what we're seeing in the present now 7-8 years later than anything that's out there. I think that, it's interesting. He and I traveled to 40 different countries, and based on what we were seeing and hearing, we looked at each of these countries and we asked, what are the problems of the physical world, and how will those problems spill over onto the internet? And we use that to make our we use that to make our predictions. So I think that, we got a lot in that book that I think accurately describes the world that we live in today. I'm surprised that we got there this fast. I would say there are some things that we missed. We really didn't foresee the level of disinformation that we're seeing and the impact that it's having on democracy. And as I said earlier, I think we underestimated the resilience of authoritarian systems to navigate more information and more voices while maintaining their authoritarian system. So I think that we miscalculated on those two fronts.
All right. Some people are asking, the name of the book is The New Digital Age. And some people are asking, I think they can get it on Amazon, right?
Yep, they can get it on Amazon.
All right. So on Amazon, you can get it. So folks who are asking questions concerning it. It's called The New Digital Age, and it's on Amazon. I remember you signed a copy for me, so mine is. All right, then. Okay. Question number 7. You have witnessed the power of information up close. How do you explain the surge? You alluded to it now, the surge in fake news across the world, because it's getting to real dangerous levels. Is this because information editing is cheap to do, or is there something else more sinister at play?
So I think I tend to talk about disinformation more broadly, because I think fake news is one type of disinformation. So when I think of fake news, I think of literally fake news outlets that are masquerading as publishers. But if you break down disinformation, so we'll get to the tactics in a second, but why do governments and non-state actors push disinformation? They do it to influence a political outcome or a political context. They do it to exacerbate ethnic, sectarian, or sort of national tensions within a country. They do it for economic gain. And in some cases, they do it in direct support of military operations. It's a military tactic. So all forms of disinformation exist in those 4 categories. So then let's get to who are the characters involved in disinformation. So you have governments, you have criminals who are in it for the money, you have criminals who are in it for the cause. So those are the sort of malicious actors. Then you get people who do it by accident. They're an inadvertent part of the disinformation echo chamber, and they just sort of believe the stuff that they're reading, and they end up passing it along. So they're kind of inadvertent super spreaders of disinformation. So those are the different types of characters that you get. Then you have the tactics. So we talked about fake news as a tactic. Another tactic is commandeering social media profiles, so that unbeknownst to Pastor Poju, I live in Macedonia, and I find his picture on the internet, and I create a totally different person with a totally different identity. It's sort of a version of identity theft, and he doesn't know that all of his images and videos and so forth are being used to portray him as somebody who lives in Pennsylvania. So that's the second type. A third type is social chatbot automation, which is kind of the automated echo chambers that we see. A fourth is the kind of hack and leak and the manipulation of that content. A fifth is the distortion of video and images, deep fakes and doctored images. And in some respects, the most dangerous is information where the content is not manipulated, but it's deliberately taken out of context. So out of content is extremely dangerous because it's based on a truth, but misportrayed. I think that if you look at Russian activity in the United States, in 2016, they were trying to flip an outcome. I would say by 2018, they were trying to spread this. They were still manufacturing disinformation to foment chaos in the US. If you look at the Russian tactics today look for pockets of sentiments within the United States. They're basically identifying people with real beliefs that are saying real things that they really believe, and they're just amplifying them. So we've entered a new chapter of disinformation where you're seeing less you're seeing less synthetic content being deployed from abroad into another ecosystem, and instead you're seeing organic content that's coming from the citizens of that particular country. It's being amplified and repurposed, and I think that's what's so dangerous. Is in a world of social media, everybody has a voice, but those voices are not equal. The loudest, most obnoxious voice tends to win out, and the more sane, sort of boring, wonky, sensible voices end up getting drowned out. And so that's kind of what we're up against. And disinformation in authoritarian systems, it comes from the state, but they have managed to avoid a situation where you have massive amounts of organic disinformation. So this seems to be a problem that disproportionately impacts democracies. So not surprisingly, the enemies of democracy are seeking to exploit it.
All right, sir. All right, we're coming to a close of this. So let me move up to another question here. Now, in today's world, remote work and immigration is becoming a good avenue for talent to be democratized. However, politics seems to be getting in the way. In your opinion, how can government support local talents to better improve their exposure, visibility from an international standpoint?
So look, the good news is collaboration is going to get easier, right? So this goes back to what I said before, which is the best way to build a great company is find the best people and build a team around a concrete problem. So identify a problem, find the best people with the most diversified skill sets, and build a team around them. And it used to be that team all needed to be geographically co-located. And I think one of the things that comes out of the COVID-19 era is I think we're all learning how to be more collaborative at a distance, right? So I would feel more confident that I could, found a company today with, 2 people in Nigeria, 2 people in Kenya, 2 people in Finland, 1 person in Brazil. Like that wouldn't seem like a bad idea to me now that I've been working remotely and collaborating remotely for 4 months. So this idea that everybody once had to be in the same place, I think is an idea that's being really challenged by the moment. That being said, I think we should we should want talent to go where talent wants to go. And I'm a big believer in not letting politics get in the way of that.
All right, so just 2 more questions. One, fundraising can be one of the most difficult steps for startups to accomplish in Africa, especially in Nigeria, whereas San Francisco, for example, it's so much easier to access capital. And so the question is, how do we build trust between ecosystems in emerging countries and Silicon Valley? How can we do that?
So so it's interesting. I remember on my first trip to Nigeria, which I think my first trip to Nigeria, it may have actually been when I came to the platform. I think that was the first time that I'd been to the and what I heard from entrepreneurs is that exact thing. We're having, there's lots of money in Nigeria, but that money is not flowing to Nigerian entrepreneurs. And so I suspect that complaint is still there. The good news, there's a lot of good news here. One, you don't need, it would be great for Nigerian money to go to Nigerian companies. You don't need that. There's the opportunities and the ecosystem for outside capital is much greater now. The other thing is there's a real movement since that first trip that I took to Nigeria around sort of social impact investing. I can tell you, people in Silicon Valley, they like the idea of investing in countries outside of the United States, and particularly in the developing world, that are trying to solve a problem that will better the world, but also be a good business. So that's a really interesting, the social impact space is a good space for the Nigerian entrepreneur to be in. But there's also just, I do think, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and people with capital in Silicon Valley, they love Africa. The criticism I have of them is they view Africa as too monolithic. Each country, has its own identity and many identities within it. But Nigeria doesn't have a problem being on the radar screen of Silicon Valley. So, and the good news for Nigerians is you really are some of the most persistent people that I've ever met. And you mix that with your ability to generate ideas, your spirit of entrepreneurship. You just have to be comfortable with rejection, right? So I remember my first book that I ever got published. I sent letters to, I think, 34 publishers, and 33 of them rejected my book, and the 34th that accepted my book was the best one of all of them. It doesn't matter how many people say no to you as long as somebody eventually says yes to you. And trust me, you build a great company. The Nigerian investors or the Nigerian capital will come in. Maybe they won't come in for the seed round, maybe they won't come in for the Series A, but they'll come in for the Series B and the Series C, and they'll be pretty unhappy that they're coming in at a later stage in the valuation. So prove them wrong. The best response for the Nigerian entrepreneur to the lack of access to capital in Nigeria is make them regret that they didn't get in at the seed round.
All right. So final question. You are known to help keep the world safer by forecasting emerging threats. Why were we as a whole world so unprepared for COVID-19 pandemic? Given what you know and what you see, to what extent are we really gone past the worst of this COVID-19?
That's a great question. Look, I think what has happened I was actually a history major. I love history, and I spent the last 6 years writing a book about presidential history. And so my mind thinks like a historian and thinks like a forecasting entrepreneur. So the way I joke about this is, during the day, I think like a Google person, and I try to forecast the future. At night and on airplanes, I'm focused on dead people and years yonder. But what we've lost the education system that is defined by critical thinking is built around this idea of the arts and the sciences. And somewhere along the lines, we got in our heads this idea that it was either or, that you either needed to be a computer scientist or a political scientist. You either needed to be a humanities person or a sciences person. And I think if you look at the tech ecosystem, it's not particularly well, it's not saturated with this idea of looking at the past and looking at history to inform the future. And if you look at the historians, they're not very good at forecasting out. So if you look at COVID-19, all of the answers are in history. We had, and you can go really far back. You can go back to the plague that gripped Europe. You can go back to Spanish influenza in 1918. You can go back to the Asian flu in 1957. You can go back to swine flu in 1976. You can go back to SARS from 20 years ago. You can go back to even with Ebola, which has sort of popped up in different. Ebola's been around since the 1970s, or possibly even earlier. So if you look at all of these, different viruses and these pandemics, the one thing that the world has a lot of experience with is lessons learned from managing pandemics well and not managing well. And the thing about pandemics is they don't care, about how fast you don't care about the data plan. The pandemic doesn't care about the data plan on your phone. The pandemic just cares if somebody coughs on you or breathes near you, or the air circulates near you in a way that you get infected with the virus. So I think that the answers to the pandemic, some of the answers to the pandemic are very analog in terms of what we know, but very sort of entrepreneurial and scientific in terms of how we deal with it. So I think that I think the answer is we need to look backwards and forwards at the same time, not do either or. I think the successful entrepreneur, is able to be both a historian and an entrepreneur at the same time. And I think if you're leading an organization, it's incumbent on you to build a culture that encourages looking forwards and looking backwards at the same time.
Jared, thank you very much for this insightful session. All right, a lot of comments coming in, very, very insightful. All right, you have anything you want to say in closing?
I just want to express my gratitude. Pastor Pojo, you are full of energy, and I think it's a testament to you that you're able to pull together such extraordinary groups of people. And I really, really am just incredibly bummed out that I'm not with you all in person. But your energy comes through the screen of my machine. My only regret is I can't see the crowd while we're there. So my great appreciation for being invited back to the platform, and let's get me back to Nigeria sometime when all of this is done.
Thank you very much, Jared. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right.